excited to talk about Pi for the first time on my channel. And no, not the kind you eat, but the latest version of the incredibly popular single-board computer. The Raspberry Pi 5 is here, and I've been spending a lot of time with it, testing all sorts of fun things out, and of course for the channel we will be definitely examining its capabilities for gaming, emulation, and more. The Pi 5 promises to bring quite a bit more power over its predecessor, so please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore all the capabilities and features of the Raspberry Pi 5 and find out if this Pi is worth the slice. Let's first dive into the specs of the Raspberry Pi 5, as well as talk about some of its interesting features. First things first, the Raspberry Pi 5 retains the credit card-sized board that has become a staple of the Raspberry Pi. The Pi 5 is powered by the Broadcom-designed BCM2712, which features 4 Cortex-A76 cores clocked at 2.4 GHz. For the GPU, we have the Broadcom Video Core 7 with support for OpenGL ES 3.1 and Vulkan 1.2, and it was designed in Cambridge, UK, the home city of the Raspberry Pi. My model has 4GB of LPDDR4X SD RAM with an 8GB variant available as well. On board we have dual-band 802.11ac Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 5.0, and a microSD slot. There are 2 USB 3.0 ports, 2 USB 2.0 ports, Gigabit Ethernet, and 2 micro HDMI which output at 4K, as well as USB Type-C for power. Lastly, the Raspberry Pi is still manufactured in the UK at the Sony Technology Centre in Wales. It is available now for purchase with the 4GB version priced at $60 or $80 for the 8GB model. It does look like popular online stores like KonstaKang are taking pre-orders for the next batch, which is due sometime in February. It's time to take a look at the Raspberry Pi 5 in hand, and as you can see, I purchased the 4GB model as well as the official case and active cooler for it. And of course we have a tiny box for a tiny board and with plenty of Raspberry Pi branding all around. On the back we have the full specs of the Pi 5, which we just discussed. Let's go ahead and tear the front flap open and check out what's inside. Now, this should be a fairly familiar sight for owners of prior models of the Pi, and here is a nice centered shot of the board. On one side we have the vast amount of input options available, including the 2 USB 3.0 and 2 USB 2.0 ports, as well as the Gigabit Ethernet. Coming around we have the standard 40-pin Raspberry Pi header and then PCI Express and physical power button on board. On the back of the board we have the micro SD slot. And on the side opposite of the 40-pin header we have the USB Type-C port and the 2 micro HDMI ports, which both support up to 4K video out. Alright, let's continue diving into the package, and we have an insert card that channels IKEA with very cryptic images, and I'd love to hear in the comments what you think some of these images are trying to depict. And finally we have the Raspberry Pi 5 safety and user guide. Let's take a look at the next package here, which is the official Raspberry Pi 5 case. The case is available for $10 and Raspberry Pi 4 cases will not work. There are already great 3D printed options available for those that prefer an option like that, and I'm sure we will see more case options from third parties in the next few months. I actually 3D printed this awesome one here, and I will have a link down below to the specific one, but this is mostly serving as an example of what's out there. As the back of the package states, this is a clipped together 4-part enclosure with an active cooling fan for the Raspberry Pi. Alright, let's get this out of here, and I have to say I've always liked the look of the official Raspberry Pi cases with the two-tone white and red. It's clean and simple. Let's look around the case quickly, and everything is nicely labeled with appropriate cutouts for all the necessary connections. You can see there is a small gap at the top to allow airflow for that active cooling. Another nice thing here is the easily accessible power switch and micro SD slot, and believe me, that has come in very handy just hopping between different operating system setups. So as the packaging mentioned, everything here clips together, and so let's first remove the top portion to reveal the built-in active cooling. This is different than what is offered in their separate active cooling kit, which we will talk about in just a little bit. Let's go ahead and get the next portion separated, which reveals a folded insert placed inside that contains the rubber feet for the bottom of the case, as well as the heatsink for this specific kit. Now I will be putting this heatsink aside since I have the separate active cooling kit, which contains a much beefier heatsink for the Raspberry Pi 5. And I think this is the perfect time to unbox the active cooler kit, which is available for only $5 US. As you can see on the front, the heatsink here is definitely more substantial than what is provided in the official case kit. Just like everything else here, this kit clips onto the board, making assembly nice and easy. Getting the fan out of the package, and immediately you can see that we have a sizable plate with 3 thermal pads applied. I definitely recommend going this route if you have plans to push the Raspberry Pi 5, especially with overclocks. Personally, I have managed as much as 2.7 GHz, and I know that others have pushed it to 3 GHz. You will also want a beefy power supply to be able to sustain those higher clocks. So something like the official Pi 5 power supply or something with similar 5V 5A power delivery will be a good option. I really can't stress how important this is for the Pi 5, especially when really pushing it and keeping lots of accessories connected to it. The fans themselves are similar in size between the one on the official case and the one here with the active cooling kit. Now you're probably wondering, how does this all come together if there's already a fan present on the official case? The nice thing about all the official kit is that everything is meant to work together. And so the Pi team thought this through, and in order to use the official case with the active cooling kit, you will need to remove the fan in the case, which is clipped on using the clear plastic portion. Once we remove that part, you can see that we will be able to properly place the active cooling kit on the board to be used with the official case. So let's go ahead and place down the active cooler and heatsink onto the board. Again, this simply clips on using these spring-loaded tabs. Also, before placing down the heatsink, make sure to remove the plastic film protecting the thermal pads. Okay, with the 2 clips placed in, the heatsink and fan are securely in place now. One last thing to do is connect the ribbon cable from the fan to the board, which will supply the fan with power. And this is how it should all look assembled. Now let's grab the official case and put everything else together, which is a very simple and easy process. The board sits in easily on the bottom portion of the official case. Let's grab the middle piece now and clip that into place to hold the board down. It's surprisingly very secure, and just shaking it as is and nothing is rattling around. Finally, one last thing to do here, and let's clip the top piece on and complete the assembly process. The finished product looks really nice, and I'm excited to get things going here, so let's grab a USB Type-C power supply and get going. But first things first, I heard you like operating systems, and even this early on in the Pi 5's life cycle, we have been treated to numerous operating system options. The Raspberry Pi 5 is quite a versatile little computer. Naturally, I was curious about how the various OS options fared here, and so I grabbed a cheap pack of microSD cards and prepared them all with the OSs that stood out to me. For many, one of the default and natural options to go with is Raspberry Pi OS, which comes straight from the Pi team and will have the best compatibility and support out of all of these options. Raspberry Pi OS is based on Debian 12, better known as Bookworm, which is the latest available. However, for my full-blown desktop experience, I've personally been using Ubuntu 23.10, which has official support for the Raspberry Pi 5, and I have found the experience to be very solid early on. I tested out all sorts of good stuff, including emulation. And for many of my viewers, you are already aware that I am quite the fan of Android. Of course, I had to test out KonstaKang's build of Android 14 for the Raspberry Pi 5. Android is actually quite friendly to a keyboard and mouse combo, and while it's definitely ideal to have some type of touchscreen interface, I did manage to work around some of the minor issues here. However, Android 14 performance has been the most impressive to me and really has opened the door to a lot of cool things that are only available on Android, which I will be touching upon more in just a little bit. One last OS that I did test out was Batocera, something that I covered early on for my channel on the x86 side. This build of Batocera is still in beta for Raspberry Pi 5, and I do look forward to seeing it further develop. Pis have always been solid with Batocera, and if your intent is something strictly gaming focused, Batocera is not a bad option at all. For everything here, and for everything else that I didn't cover, such as RetroPie, Recalbox, and others, I expect that support will get better over time, but for now, I've been pretty impressed with what's out there. So naturally, one might wonder just how much more powerful the Raspberry Pi 5 is over its predecessor, the Pi 4. And as I talked about earlier, the Pi 5 has 4 Cortex-A76 cores clocked at 2.4 GHz, and I've personally been able to overclock to around 2.7 GHz reliably. Compared to the Pi 4, which had 4 Cortex-A72 cores clocked at 1.8 GHz, we are seeing a fairly sizable jump in performance. The Raspberry Pi team claims nearly 2 to 3 times the CPU and GPU performance. As I always like to do with new hardware, let's check out some numbers with synthetic benchmarks to get an idea of where the Pi 5 stands, especially compared to its predecessor. All tests were done at the standard 2.4 GHz clock speed out of the box in Android 14. So let's start out with the Geekbench 6 numbers, which will give us a good idea of CPU performance. The Raspberry Pi 5 achieved a 765 single-core score and 1536 for the multi-core score. Now pulling recent benchmarks for the Raspberry Pi 4, which settles in at 283 for the single-core score and 605 for the multi-core score. This represents nearly a 170% increase in performance on the single core and around 154% improvement on the multi-core score. We are definitely seeing in synthetic testing the performance improvements on the CPU side with those 4 Cortex A76 cores. And right now, it stays true to the Pi team's claims of 2 to 3 times performance improvements. For the GPU portion, I will be using the Slingshot Extreme Test in 3D Mark. And in my own testing, the Raspberry Pi 5 scored a 1079. For the Raspberry Pi 4, I pulled numbers from the Raspberry Pi forums as recent as last month, and the Pi 4 in the Slingshot Extreme Test scored 324, which represents the overall numbers for it. And in the GPU test, we are seeing a solid performance improvement over the Pi 4, representing nearly a 233% improvement. So it's now time to get to the good stuff and talk about emulation, which longtime viewers of the channel know that this is what it's all about. The Raspberry Pi 5 for many will be quite competent for different use cases, but my interest, and the interest of many here, has always been about seeing how far we can push hardware, and emulation has always been one of the best ways to do that. I mentioned earlier just how impressed I was with the performance of Android 14 on the Raspberry Pi 5, and most of the emulation that you will be seeing here was conducted in Android 14. It's certainly not without its issues, and I spent a good amount of time hopping between Raspberry Pi OS, Ubuntu, Batocera, and of course Android. For my own use cases, I liked what I was able to do with Android the most, and so for PlayStation 2, PlayStation Portable, Gamecube, and even Wii, I found that performance was pretty solid and reliable. The extra power of the Raspberry Pi 5 is on full display here, since if you were on a Raspberry Pi 4, or at least familiar with it, you would know that PS2, GameCube, and Wii were certainly possible, but realistically could not run much of anything outside of the barest and lightest games. For PlayStation Portable, we are seeing improvements across the board, and coming from a Raspberry Pi 4, PSP is now what I consider fully playable on the Pi 5. For example, the God of War games and Gran Turismo run at a full speed here on the Pi 5. In fact, I was able to go with 2 times upscaling on Gran Turismo, which is nice to see. As expected, given the power on hand, some games will perform better than others. The lighter games such as personal favorites of mine like Loco Roco and Lumines can now enjoy as much as 5 times upscaling. And even the harder to run games like MotorStorm Arctic Edge and Outrun 2006 are all performing quite well here. With the Raspberry Pi 5, we are now entering the realm of PlayStation 2 emulation being realistically possible. We aren't fully there yet, unfortunately, as the more demanding games like Shadow of the Colossus, for example, will not happen here on the Pi 5. However, I have to always say this, but given the size of the PlayStation 2 library, there is a lot that can be actually played here on the Pi 5. For all of my testing, I use the PAL versions, which allows us to squeeze just a little bit more in terms of what can be playable. Now, I tested some of my usual favorites, and some definitely fare better than others. For example, Burnout Revenge is a game that probably just won't happen here. I wasn't expecting a whole lot, but with some heavy tweaking, God of War, for example, got to a playable state, but again, there's a good amount being sacrificed here, and it's not what I'd say is an ideal experience. But lots of the middle ground games will work quite well here, and I tested an assortment ranging from Alien Hominid, Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex, Devil May Cry, and plenty of others. I am definitely not done with PlayStation 2 emulation, and will be planning a dedicated video to the topic shortly. Now let's talk about the Nintendo side, and with the Raspberry Pi 4, we also did not have the grunt to really be able to play Gamecube that well, and especially Wii. Gamecube on the Pi 4 fared worse than what we got with PSP. However, now on the Pi 5, many games for Gamecube go from suboptimal speeds to running full speed. I thought we could get a lot of the Gamecube library here, but unfortunately we are still not quite there, and games like F-Zero GX will still need some tinkering, and even then are not running at full speed. Like PS2, I am using PAL-ROMs for all my Gamecube testing to squeeze as much playability as possible. Surprisingly, I tested all sorts of builds for Dolphin and settled on the Play Store build, which definitely demonstrates how far mainline Dolphin has come, and I actually had the least issues with the Play Store build. Now, we may not be able to play F-Zero GX well on here currently, but there are still a lot of enjoyable games to check out on Gamecube. For Wii, we are definitely pushing the envelope of what is possible here with the Pi 5 currently. And I say currently because I think with further optimizations, tweaks, and just community development, we can go further than what I've experienced here with Dolphin and the Wii. For example, Super Mario Galaxy 2 shows all sorts of performance ranges going from surprisingly playable to just downright awful. For Wii, I think lighter games will be the realistic goal here, and so titles like Tatsunoko vs. Capcom and Muramasa, for example, will be the ideal types of games to enjoy here. New Super Mario Bros. Is not quite full speed, and unfortunately for my Pi, it doesn't seem to take overclocks beyond 2.7 GHz well, and so I can't give the game the extra power it might need to get to full speed. Now, I talked earlier about how I like what Android 14 means for a device like the Raspberry Pi 5. Longtime viewers know that I am passionate about high-quality, premium gaming experiences on Android, and with Android 14 being available for the Raspberry Pi 5, we have a whole world of great games available to us. Not only that, because we have some decent power under the hood, we're getting a solid experience playing a lot of very fun native Android games. This is such a cool option for those that are looking beyond just emulation experiences on the Raspberry Pi, which is quite limited without using some type of emulation or translation layer. Just like I did with emulation testing, I did the same thing here with all of the great native Android games. I started out with lighter stuff, such as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, and eventually made my way up to heavier titles like Grid Autosport, and of course everything else in between. I was definitely pleasantly surprised overall, and even games like Diablo Immortal fared quite well on the Raspberry Pi 5, and thanks to the very solid controller support in Android 14, you can go the route of either using a wired controller via USB, or taking advantage of the built-in Bluetooth on the Pi 5 and going wireless, and I've tested a bunch of controllers without any issue, such as the Xbox Series, PS5 DualSense, and a few offerings from 8-Bit Do. And Diablo Immortal is just one of many games that fare quite well with built-in controller support. And of course, with controllers and Android, we can then talk about front ends such as Daijisho, which work great here, and with some customization, you can really make the Pi feel more like a console experience using Android in the backend. And moving away from Android, there's tons of other things to explore, and amazingly, I've only scratched the surface of what this tiny PC can do. But for that, we'll have to wait for another video. I do think the 4GB model will serve most needs, and at $60 it's not a bad piece of kit given what we get here. A lot has happened in the SBC world since the Pi 4, and we have many great low-cost options for computing. Not only that, but availability still plagues the Pi team, and like the 4, the Pi is sold out everywhere with pre-orders for an upcoming shipment, and I guess time will tell if the Pi team can keep up with the demand. One of the key standouts for something like the Pi is support, and I suspect that much like the 4, we will see tons of cool stuff that utilize the Pi 5's full potential. And I have to say, I'm pretty excited about the world that opens up to us with the extra power that we now have with the Raspberry Pi 5. For me personally, I've still got lots to explore and tinker with, and I had to pull myself away to actually put together something to share with everybody. I have a feeling I will be continuing to explore the Pi 5 on the channel, but not only that, I am very excited to see continued development for the Raspberry Pi 5, as well as further optimizations to make the hardware shine through software. Now, in terms of Pi, well, there's lots of flavors now to enjoy, and as a sneak peek, I will be discussing some other tasty varieties. But until then, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.